All right, we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everybody. Congratulations to all of you because you have outlasted many in joining us. Look around. In joining us for this last conversation as a part of today's symposium. So thank you for tuning in. My name is Shireen White. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Policy for Children's Rights, which is a national nonprofit that uses strategic advocacy and impact litigation on behalf of children who are impacted by all of America's systems, our child welfare system, our youth justice system, education system, medical and mental health systems in this country. I am joined today by an amazing panel, and so I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves, starting with Joyce McMillan.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joyce McMillan. I am a parent impacted by all of the government systems. They want us to scream, so I'm going to try to do that. I am the founder and executive director of JMAC for Families, which stands for Just Making a Change for Families. I am also the founder of Parent Legislative Action Network, which we use the acronym PLAN, and I am CPS's worst nightmare across the 50 states. And I'll pass it to my esteemed colleague, Marty Guggenheim.
Hi, I'm Marty Guggenheim. Looking around the room, I can comfortably say I've toiled in the field that we call child welfare longer than anyone in the room. And as you'll hear me say in a few minutes, I'll tell you why I hate it.
Okay, I guess I'm up. So, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Shanta and the CFCC for having me join this panel. And I'm honored to be on a part of the panel that Shireen is facilitating. My name is Stephanie Franklin. I am president and CEO of the Franklin Law Group. We are a family justice center that provides legal representation to abused and neglected children right here in the state of Maryland in 5 counties, primarily with most of our children being in Baltimore City. I'm also co-counsel on the LJ versus Masinga federal class action lawsuit on behalf of plaintiffs in Baltimore City and a possible pending lawsuit that is coming forth regarding what Ms. Nicole talked about earlier on the panel before this one on children and youth who are in hospital overstays across the state of Maryland. Thank you for having me.
All right. So I want to thank everybody, first and foremost, for being in a room with such elite minds. My name is Jamar. Pretty much colloquial, as my professor would say. I don't really kind of have a lot of esoteric jargon or like nomenclature that you all would understand or different realms would understand. So I kind of speak from the heart. I kind of, try to be as interpersonal as possible. Jamar, I worked with youth in foster care. I used to be a former foster youth. I started to turn that experience into more of a professional experience. Tried to advocate as a a foster care independent social worker. Left that because it was pretty much ridiculous to me. Right now, I'm a therapist. I work in Wisconsin. So I'm licensed in Maryland and Wisconsin. I work at an anxiety and OCD clinic. I come to you today with lived experience from a true place. So that's just a little bit about me.
Hey everyone, I am Nate Golden. I feel really lucky to be up here. I am a public school teacher in Baltimore City Schools. I teach Algebra 1 at Forest Park High School. My students were hopefully doing their work while I was gone today. And I'm also the president of the Maryland Child Alliance. We do advocacy work fighting to reduce and hopefully eventually eliminate child poverty across the state of Maryland. We partner directly with CFCC. And so I think our organization is going to do some great things. So if you want to learn more about it after this, come find me. I can talk your ear off.
Thank you all so much. And I'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that we get to be in company with Marty Guggenheim, who has just retired after 50 years of working in this field that he has just told us he hates so much. So congrats to Marty. So I'm really excited to have this discussion today, and that this symposium is focusing on family integrity. Because ironically, in this field of child welfare, we often hear conversations about parents and conversations about children. And I can't help but think how much better the results for both parents and children would be if we focused our conversations and our advocacy on families. So thank you to CFCC for forcing us to have this discussion today. And I want to remind you all that family integrity has been a long-standing fundamental liberty interest under our 14th Amendment, right? The Supreme Court has had multiple decisions acknowledging a parent's right to their family, a parent's right to parent. And our grateful host, Shanta, last summer had an article published in the Harvard Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Law Review that also informed us, guess what? Children also have that fundamental right to family, right? They have a fundamental right to be with their own family. So I also want to point out that in one of the Supreme Court cases, Santosky versus Kramer, Marty had the great pleasure of arguing in that case. And it's pretty remarkable. And it said that parental unfairness, until the state proves parental unfairness or unfitness, the child and his parents share a vital interest in preventing erroneous termination of their natural relationship. So thank you, Marty, for your work in that case. And we've been throwing around the term family integrity a lot today, but we really haven't gotten to the heart of what that means. And so I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just go down the line and give us your immediate reaction, your gut reaction. When you hear those words, family integrity, what comes up for you? Your first choice.
Okay, I'm just making sure, because I have a problem with taking over. No. I like to reframe things all the time. And so I would like to reframe from what family integrity is to what government integrity ain't. And what it ain't is an entity that cares about the natural bonds of families, the best outcome for children, what it means to long for your family forever, what it means to be separated from your siblings, what it means to lack stability, what it means to grow up knowing that your trajectory is to be incarcerated, being unable to read or write, and having all of these things happen at the hands of people, the government, who took you out of your home under the guise of protecting you, knowing the only thing they will protect you from is success.
It was deep.
Follow that, Marty.
So at a theoretical level, family integrity, as the Supreme Court described it, is meant to reflect the freedom of families to make all the critical decisions for themselves, and to give parents the basic freedom to choose the values to inculcate their children with, and the education and other things that they would receive. But of course, that theoretical answer clashes against a reality in this country, and the child welfare system exposes the reality of how limited a freedom of family integrity is for black and brown families and indigenous families. And as Brian Stevenson often says, in this field, our goal should be to treat all families as if they were white privileged families, which is what the family integrity principle is really about.
So family integrity to me is a very layered term. And it's a human right, number one. But where it takes me initially, like really strongly, is back to the experience of my ancestors who are descendants of captive and enslaved Africans in the U.S. That's where I start. So I begin to think about what family separation meant to those whose blood flows through my veins day to day. So for me, not only am I feeling it intrinsically in my DNA, but then I watch it working, representing children who are part of a family unit that we tend to want to overlook. I'm a children's attorney. So as a children's attorney, sometimes some of the challenges I think that I see with those who share the position that I do is that they see the child as separate from their family unit. I never saw the child as separate from their family unit. They are a part of a family unit, and with that said, we need to treat them as such. That's what family integrity meant to me. Family integrity means to me the inculcation and the continuing the legacy of understanding your cultural, your lineage rooting, the strengthening of identity, the rituals, the practices that have been handed down from generation to generation, because that's power. So family integrity overall for me is a human right that inculcates all of that.
Family integrity to me means to understand family, and they have their own identity, as you said, Ms. Franklin. Family integrity is understanding that it's an ongoing learning process. I had some issues with the term cultural competency because competency suggests that we have families down packed, and that's not. Families are ever changing. We want to be more culturally sensitive. It's an ongoing learning process, and I think that family integrity takes a person to know that this has to be an ongoing learning process. You're not going to have any culture or any family down packed. Therefore, you should take time to understand and learn families. That's it.
To me, I kind of want to build off what Stephanie was saying, that children are a part of the family unit, and so more broadly, I think a starting point is that families should have enough resources to raise their children. And from the child's perspective, that means getting to be a kid. It means getting to make mistakes. It means not worrying about how the rent's going to get paid. It means not worrying about where your next meal comes from. It means not worrying about if you're going to get taken from your parents or if your parents will get taken from you. And I think we can there's add more to it, but the starting point is just adequate resources to provide for your family.
Thank you all so much. So I want to build on everything that you just told us. And so based on what you shared about how you understand family integrity, can you talk to us about the ways in which the child welfare system either supports or undermines your concept of family integrity? We can go right down the line again. Joyce?
Yeah. In so many different ways. They undermine the family by first coming in and being judgmental towards your situation, having families and community live in complete fear of them, and creating a negative impact for all who are under their surveillance. By surveilling us in everything that we do, I tell people being black in America is 2 jobs in itself, 2 full-time jobs. And then you have the responsibility of being a parent, in some cases a spouse, and maintaining a 9-to-5 job for many, and on and on and on. It creates unnecessary stress, which becomes part of the failing of the community because of everything that is stripped from us under the guise of protecting us or protecting others from us, however they're framing it in the moment. But I can tell you what it did to my family. After having my children snatched from me when my youngest child was only a couple of months old, it completely shattered the bond between us. She was returned to me when she was 2.5 years old with many behavioral issues because she was traumatized. I wasn't able to see her often. they found every reason in the world to not allow me to see that baby. They wanted her to be adopted, but I fought. And I got her back, but she wasn't the child that went into care. And I did not know how to deal with what I was experiencing at such an early age as behavioral issues. And I was afraid to share that with anyone because to me that meant reseparation. And I had never anticipated that I was going to have the problems that I was experiencing when she returned. She was just so angry. I had never seen an angry 26-month-old. And she was just angry. And how that led to years later when she entered the school system in what's called District 2 in New York City, which is the Wall Street area that I fought to put my children in because by that time I was working downtown and I wanted my children near me. And it was a very white and very racist school system. Not that all school systems ain't really racist, right? But it was a lot worse. It was heightened. And how that caused me to over-police her myself. I started doing to her what systems had done to me and what they were doing to me and what I was afraid of happening. So I began to adultify my children, and I didn't allow them to explore the world the way children should to grow up and be healthy. It did not help that my child was defiant like me. It did not help that she was rambunctious like me. It did not help that she had her own mind like me. And so what did that mean? That meant I had to be really punitive to control her, to keep systems from interfering with our life because the school system repeatedly called anytime she did anything. She ran in the hallway once and they said, we've told her 5 times not to run in the hallway. You need to take her for a mental health evaluation. When I refused to do so, she was 7 years old. When I refused to do so, they called my local CPS, which is called ACS, the Administration for Children's Services. So I got calls on top of calls. And what that means to me is that I ended up causing a lot of harm to my own family. And I don't have a relationship with my youngest child now because of the natural bond that was broken and my inability to understand how to rebuild that bond. So I personally hate them. It's not a word I use often, and there's only one set of people that I say it about, and it's people who interfere in the lives of family under the guise of helping while destroying us.
So it's hard to add anything to that. Other than to say that in a fundamental way, our system operates quite successfully in guaranteeing family integrity to the multiple families that the system daren't ever touch. So I do a survey commonly when I teach, asking students in one of my seminars, how many know people who grew up in foster care? And in a racially diverse class, I find almost invariably the white students don't raise their hand, and no student of color fails to raise their hand. And so family integrity thrives in much of the United States for privileged families and non-white families, white families. But this system ravages families, destroys them at a world outlying rate, and Joyce said it better than I could.
So for me, this is something that I've been seeing brewing over years, and it's really starting to gain a lot of momentum and a lot of power. And it's under the guise of empowering children, we're actually allowing them to discount what their own parents are saying to them, what their own parents are expecting of them. but it's just all under the empowerment of children. And so what I'm seeing for a system that is largely non-white, where you have a disproportionate number of black children in that system, a disproportionate number of Native American children in the system. What I'm seeing is, from where I look, a very Eurocentric way of raising children, which culturally is very different, right? So I come, not only am I black, my specific ethnicity is that I am a black person who is descended from captive and enslaved Africans in the U.S. In short, what that means is that it was my ancestors who built this country off their back and propelled this country to be the most wealthiest and powerful country in the world, period. And I'm very clear about that. And with that, right, I see the different ways that different families raise their children, regardless of what their racial or ethnic identity is. There are some commonalities, and then there are some things that are not common. There are some things that are common that might be, you know, this U.S. identity versus a non-U.S. identity. Things can be very different. So what I recognize is that there is a lack of respect for any family and its cultural practices that are non-Eurocentric. And so in this empowerment of children that we are really pushing and has been gaining a lot of momentum over the years, I found the children to be very disrespectful to adults. I find that we are asking children to make decisions that are very heavy decisions that impact the rest of their lives, while at the same time we're saying that their brains don't fully develop until they're 25. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to understand the irony here. It's very strange to me. And so what I think is very important is that children have a voice and what happens to them, but I think it needs to be weighted. So when a child says, I don't want to visit my parent, well, you know, your parent is really working to have you back in their care. You know, part of that is depending on the circumstances, depending on the age, so on and so forth. I think that needs to be weighted. You need to start connecting with your parent. You need to start visiting with your parent. So all of it becomes very complex. I think it's very difficult sometimes, but I'm watching kids get empowered to the point that I feel like they're undermining the relationship between that child and the family.
Woo, that was fire. I think that the system has a lack of care. I think it was Dr. Maya Angelou that said, you have to, before you lend a hand, you have to lend your heart. And I don't think that the system comes from a place of love. You have to connect before you correct. They come from more of a authoritative place, a mountaintop looking in the valley place. There's a complete disconnect between the system, and they completely undermine the family unit in that sense. Even if, like Ms. McMillan talked about the adultification of children, especially black children, to even down to the treatment planning process. And I know because I was on that side, they tend to have a cookie cutter approach to how they go about serving families. You cannot have a cookie cutter approach simply because there's no buy-in within the families. And when you don't buy in, it does not work if they don't work it. So I always say we have a foster care system that fosters our youth but lacks the care. So, that's all I got to say.
I defined family integrity as having adequate resources, and so I want to just quickly talk about how the government attempts to provide that and where we fail. At the federal level, we have basically two major tax credits that are aimed at boosting family incomes. We have the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit, but both of those tax credits miss the most vulnerable families. The child tax credit, you're not even eligible until you have $2,500 in income. It phases in, so a mother of 3 is going to need nearly $50,000 in income before they get the full credit. You have to pay enough in taxes to get the full credit, and your child has to have a social security number, so it misses a lot of undocumented families and homes. And so the end result of that is that only a third of children in the United States live in households that are too poor to get the full credit, and only half of Black and Hispanic homes get the full credit. Our other credit, the Earned Income Tax Credit, has all the same issues. It phases in, and so it misses the families at the bottom of the income distribution. At the state level, for its own part, Maryland just blindly matches the federal Earned Income Tax Credit. So we also miss those families. And we're not hitting them at a local level either. And so what we have is a government system that misses the most vulnerable families at every level of government. So I think we're going to talk about improvements in the next down the line, so I won't get into that, but that's where we are from meeting or guaranteeing families adequate resources.
Thank you. I want to go back to Jamar for a second, because what I think you're talking about is the way in which the system approaches and works or does not work with families. So can you talk more about how that should be different? What should look differently if you're truly going to help families and lift up family integrity?
I think you have to connect to the community. It's just we see the disconnection. It's just very clear. When a person from the state or someone that is representing the system comes into communities, they tend to, you can see them. You can see that they're not genuine with their approach. You can see that they come from more of a, like I said, authoritative approach. We tell you what to do, and then, you just don't have a way to engage in families. I just talked to someone out my professor, and he talked about how, people that represent me come from those particular communities, come from in the trenches in the valley, and tries to approach families with care versus, someone who goes to school and do the social work thing, the lawyer thing, and they have a complete, separate outlook on families. So they don't come with the care, they don't come with the genuineness, they don't come with the authenticity.
Yeah, thank you. It reminds me, in my work as a child advocate, like how often families are told what they need to do and what the next steps are, and rarely asked what they actually need. So thanks for raising that. I think in prior years, we may have sat here and talked to you about the history of the child welfare system, or run down some data about disproportionality in the child welfare system, or attempted to convince you that the system is racist. And I think we're further along now, and I don't think we need to spend time on that conversation. And recently, there have been a number of entities that have really acknowledged the systemic racism in the child welfare system, and that have called out the failures of this system and the disproportionate harm that it causes Black and Indigenous and Brown families. And for example, the New York State Bar Association published a report on this very issue. The Biden administration and the Administration for Children and Families have acknowledged this very thing. The ABA, the American Bar Association, they've issued a resolution that focuses on racism in this child welfare system. And recently, Joyce and I were able to advocate before the United Nations in Geneva to a committee on the elimination of racial discrimination. And since that time, they too have acknowledged that the United States is failing in the child welfare system, as it is in other systems, families of color. So we're not going to spend time convincing you on that today. You can read Dorothy Roberts' book, Torn Apart, or Shattered Bonds, or any of the other materials that are out there that can educate you on that. While we have these experts here, I want to sort of transition us to a conversation. I think in the keynote, Andrea James called it creating what difference looks like. And so I want to ask our panelists, and we can start with Joyce, to talk to us. What does different look like in this future that she envisions for actually caring for children and families?
I think what different looks like is different for us, changing it to being equivalent to what other communities get without asking and fighting. The freedom to be. It's really that simple. It's not convoluted. Stop setting us up for failure. Stop suspending and expelling our children from school, knowing how detrimental that is to their long-term education process. Stop mistreating us in hospitals by taking our children when you should be providing medical assistance. Stop accusing us just simply because you don't like and trust us, and then turning around and blaming our failures on us and not the intervention that systems have brought into our lives that are destructive. Quickly, I'll tell you a story about me speaking at an Ivy League school. And of course, I went through my regular rhetoric about racism and what it looks like, how subliminal it is, and how we can often miss it, especially when we're not impacted by it. And I had talked about this 1,000 times. And this particular day, some little bold white guy says in class, like, I want to respond. Like, go ahead. So Billy says, I'm tired of black people blaming us for their woes. He really said this to me. He said, it's not our fault that you don't want to read a book or graduate school, or that the women want to have babies by different fathers that don't take care of their kids. And he went through the whole narrative of what they say about my community. I was stunned. And the children or the young adults in the class was looking at me like, Miss, what you gonna say now? And I took a breath and I said, do you know what a historical building is? And they were really looking at me like crazy then, because they was like, how did she go from that to what is a historical building? I was like, entertain me. And I pointed out one of the students and I asked them to answer it, and they said, it's a building that is protected by the city or the state that has been standing for maybe more than 100 or 150 years, where you can't make any exterior or exterior changes without government approval. And I said, absolutely. So now they're all looking at me, what the hell does that have to do with what we were talking about? And it goes back to what Stephanie was saying. I said, do you know who built a building 100 or 150 years ago? I said, a black man with not only not having a college degree, more than likely not even having a high school diploma. A blueprint that he created, built for probably free, definitely less than what he was worth per hour, and that building is still standing. And the last time I checked, all of the protected buildings was built around that same time frame by black hands, blood, sweat, and tears, and the buildings that are dropping are the ones that was created by white kids in Ivy League schools with degrees. You are not smarter than us. And you only have the privileges that you have because you have not been separated the way that we have and terrorized in the same manners that we have been. And I say that to say that we create these places like Ivy League schools only to separate who is allowed to achieve. The failings of our community was created. Can we do some things differently? I don't want to not take any responsibility, but I know foundationally it's embedded in us from the moment we leave our parents' womb to be fearful of people outside the home because our parents passed that fear down on us. And it is a generational impact, and it is a failing of America. It is not a failing of my community.
Thank you, Joyce. Somebody want to respond to that? I don't want to let that go. Jamar, Stephanie?
I can. I think a change. I think that we can. It confuses me that the way the system works is they have 100% authority, but yet not 100% responsibility when things go wrong. I think that we need to place urban strong leadership. Shout out to Morgan State. We got a couple Morgan heads in here. Urban strong representation, urban strong leadership. And then understanding that the people within the system, they have something to offer too. So not just within the system, but also in communities. Everyone has something to offer. I believe it was Frantz Fanon, who was a psychiatrist here in Maryland, who was a friend of Malcolm X. He said that every generation has something to offer, and through relative obscurity, shall we help them fulfill it or betray it? Let me say that one more time. Every generation has something to offer, and through relative obscurity, which means it relates no matter how big or small, should we help fulfill it or betray it? So we all have a part in changing the system, helping people fulfill their destinies, or else we'll be doing the latter.
So
Go ahead, Marty.
let me build on these two statements, especially Joyce's about we've created this world, and for a white guy to say you've screwed up by living in poverty and having an unequal chance in life. The guy over there on the wall purported to have changed American law because through 1954, so every day of American life from its foundation until 1954, it was lawful to have segregation, and the Supreme Court pretended that there was de jure segregation, but we knew that there was de facto inequality, and that's what Justice Marshall condemned. He said it's a fake equality. And the Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional to have separate but equal. But read Justice Marshall's dissent in 1973 in San Antonio School District versus Rodriguez, in which the Supreme Court reversed the principle. We now have de facto segregation and de jure inequality. That's called progress. That's called fake progress. So we are proud, white Americans today, of having outlawed segregation. And what we baked into that regime was structural inequality. We guaranteed that children condemned to live in low-taxed communities will get an inferior education. That's the American way. So when we ask questions about why our communities of poverty struggling, the answer stares us in the face. I want to say a bit more, but I'll wait for a down-the-line question to connect that to this subject of this so-called child welfare field. But the main point here is the inequality in this country is baked in by rule of law.
Yes.
The Constitution made us do it.
Yes. Yes.
You can follow up your statement, Marty. You can keep
I
going.
want to follow up. Shit.
He wants to connect it to child welfare.
Well, if you want me to connect it
Yeah,
to
say
child
something
welfare,
about the way we
look,
practice.
Child welfare isn't about child well-being at all. It's got nothing to do with child well-being. It's a scheme used by politicians and other public officials to allow the United States to divert attention from the multiple ways that government inflicts violence, pain, and suffering on children every day. There's no country in the world comparable in wealth to the United States that does such an abysmal job protecting children from the multifaceted harms associated with poverty and racial disparities. In dozens of ways, especially Black, brown, and Native American children are exposed to extremely dangerous conditions that commonly have one of two characteristics. They're imposed on children directly by state actors, or the harmful conditions are both foreseeable, known to state actors who fail completely to prevent children from being harmed. These are preventable, and the government fails to take any steps to do it. Lead poisoning in school water pipes, in paint in buildings where children live, in Baltimore. Children die young and have lifelong health conditions. They live shorter lives. Respiratory diseases, rates of up to 15 times greater than their white counterparts. All purposeful, all planned, but most of all preventable. So what would a child welfare system address? That. And when it does, I'll call it a child welfare system. But no commissioner of the officially named child welfare agency in any city or state in the country has within her portfolio a single one of these matters. Instead, it's exclusively limited to harms that may be caused to children by their parents. And when we expand the idea from parents to family, it's the harm allegedly inflicted on children by their families and only by their families. That's not a child welfare system. That's a family regulation system.
Amen. But listen, yeah, give it to him. Give it to him. Hey, amen. Right? I like this white guy. I like him. But you know, he said something about the Constitution, and this is my opening that I would be remiss if I didn't go through today, because every day of my life I say this to someone, and now today I have you guys. When we talk about the Constitution, we have to think about the 13th Amendment. The only way to have slaves in this country is through the 13th Amendment, that loophole, that back door. That's why we went from incarceration to mass incarceration, because we needed a mass amount of slaves, and so we started incarcerating people at a faster rate. But then we got even smarter, and we brought the child welfare system, as they like to call it, into play. Children, just like prisoners, are strip searched. They strip search them under the guise of checking for marks and bruises, even though we know 87% of children who enter the foster care system are there for reasons related to neglect. Poverty framed as neglect based on capital legislation, right? The Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. But then they both change homes and cells regularly. They both use garbage bags or pillowcases to change locations. They both have set visit times on set visit days. They both have oversight during the visit. They both eat what they are served. And in lieu of time, if they're released from state custody, because they are both in state custody, they are both paroled to either their family or to the community. We continue to call this a pipeline from foster care to prison. It is not a pipeline. It is a prerequisite. It is a training. It is a conditioning to ensure that they will be ready to live in the circumstances we are pipelining them to. It starts with the training, the prerequisite class of this is how you will be treated as an incarcerated person. Be prepared, be ready to take your clothes off as an adult. You've been doing it since you were a child.
So Joyce is running through the parallels between the criminal legal system and the family regulation system. And since we did have that panel earlier talking about parental incarceration as a driver of family separation, I want to turn to Stephanie because you've represented countless children, and I can't imagine how many of them were impacted by parental incarceration. And I want to hear about what their experiences were like and the ways in which the child welfare system or family regulation system further worked to separate them from their incarcerated parents.
Okay, I want to answer your question, but it's been so much fire on this panel.
Tackle it.
And I'm going to go. I'll weave it in because Joyce started it off, and then Jamar said some things, and then Mr. Guggenheim said some things. I am going to call you Mr. Guggenheim. It's out of respect.
Oh, man, I just said
that's my
that.
culture. It's out of respect. But so you asked, how do you reimagine the child welfare system? I have sat with this question, not just because of this panel, for years, right? My entire career doing this, and I've been representing kids for 23 years. It's been a long time. And I always felt this is not the system for black children. We want to talk about structural racism, which is really, really clear, right? But we talk about explicit bias, we talk about implicit bias, and I can honestly say, how do you change people's minds about what has been, as we've heard here, baked in? Mr. Guggenheim talked about things, these policies, these laws, these structures, these things have been baked in. How do you change when people are so wired to believe certain things about children? I was at Shepherd Pratt, which is a big institution here, but one of my children was there in a residential treatment facility. It's a locked facility for kids with behavioral and emotional issues. And I want to describe you to him. I want to describe him. So he's only 16, but he's like 6'4", 6'5". He's a large young man with a really extremely baby face. He looks like a little kid, but people don't see him like a little kid, right? So when he gets angry about certain things and he reacts, he's getting physically restrained by grown men, in facilities. People are afraid of him, even though when you look at him, he looks like just a big kid. And so we had a conversation about some things that happened at the facility and also what could happen on the outside in case he engaged with the police. And he said, Miss Stephanie, I would never hurt anybody. It's just really, that's just not who I am. People say that I'm big and I'm this, but I would never harm anybody. I said, I know that. But it's the imaging of what people are saying that black men look like. It is the imaging and it is the stereotyping of how we describe black women and black girls, right? And so these are the children and the families who are principally engaged in the child welfare system. And I said, how in the world do I think of how we can reimagine a system that's not a system for us at all? can't. And I'm not certain that I will. Right? So for me, it gets back to the communal base, right? And having trusted members of a community, and I won't be long, so I want to hit your incarceration question, but just trusted members of the community, and I can go into more detail later about dealing when there is possible neglect or abuse of a child in a community, right? That's number one. But in terms of my kids, I've represented a lot of kids who had incarcerated parents. And it's been devastating to them. Because this is what people, I think, don't understand, is that a lot of these children have positive relationships with those parents, regardless of how the society may want to see them. They do. Some of them may have been the caregiver for the parent. And just, to let you know, I've done a lot of work in the prison over the years. Lots of work. Lots of legal empowerment work, healing work with both men and women, girls and boys. And I'm going to tell you, one of the things that my clients always want is connection with that particular parent. And if they're young, how do you do that when they're really little? Right? So this is where ASFA comes in. And so many, many years ago, early in my career, I wrote a chapter in this book. It was like criminal justice and social consequences. I don't know, it's been many, many years now. And I wrote specifically about what I was seeing in Baltimore City that was disturbing me at epic levels that it seemed like nobody was paying attention to. And it was that we have ASFA, right, which you have the 15 out of the 22 months. And I'm looking at a number of black families, and understand Baltimore City is a black decal city. It is a city that is primarily black people who were descendants of captive and enslaved Africans in the U.S. There are other ethnicities as well, but this is principally that city. We're in the South, folks. And so having said that, I wrote this chapter on, we have this 15 out of the most recent 22 months that the department must file a petition to terminate parental rights unless there's a compelling reason not to do so. And I'm looking at the countless black men and black women that are being paraded in juvenile court in Baltimore City who are subjected to a termination of parental rights petition that they haven't had any contact with the child. Because why? Caseworkers or social workers don't want to take them there, right? Or they don't have like their support workers taking them there. Or there are some jurisdictions, not Baltimore City, but there are other jurisdictions across this state that will say in a court order, parent is entitled to visitation unless they're incarcerated. It will blatantly say that. And so to answer your question, a lot of my children had great emotional difficulty with being separated from their parent, not having any contact with their parent, whether it is, and it was mentioned on the panel earlier today, the calls are expensive. Many caregivers, if they're even with their relatives, they can't afford that. It's atrocious, right? Or they're in foster care. Most of the foster parents are not going to allow, telephone conversations or, them calling collect to speak with their children. They've been devastated by that. Devastated. And I think that I would really, and I want to talk about the hierarchy. I watched the country as when the horrible conditions and things that were happening at children at the border. They were horrible. Girl. And everybody had compassion, though. But when I think about black children who are removed from their parents daily because of some interaction with the carceral system, nobody gives a damn. Which goes, and it speaks to this whole notion of how do you change hearts and minds? Can you do that? This is structural racism at its core. I'm a person that's deep in history, and when I trace the line of what specifically has happened to black people who are descendants of captive and enslaved Africans in the U.S., I gotta tell you the pain that I carry inside of me regarding that, and then we don't want to tell the truth about it because the truth hurts. When I think about the Dozier School for Boys in Florida, in Marianna, Florida, that I know very well because my mother is from there and I knew this school very well, they were shut down after 100 years because they were abusing these little boys that were going into this detention facility. And not only were they abusing them physically, not only were they abusing them sexually, they were sexually trafficking them to older white men. That is what they were doing. They were killing these children. And guess what? This happened also during Jim Crow. Nobody talks about that. So you had black boys and white boys that were separated. And Mr. Guggenheim talked about this. He said it's been baked in, these structural inequalities, these inequities have been baked into the system. When I talk to, because I have represented a gentleman who was there during Jim Crow, and he said we were on separate facilities, the black boys and the white boys. The white boys learned trades. We worked in the fields. We were picking the produce that they were selling. I saw the records in the Florida archives, the amount of sweet potatoes they picked and the monies the school got for them. See, those are stories that nobody talks about. Those are the stories that we don't want to hear. But that is the truth of what the United States of America has done to black people who are descendants of captive and enslaved Africans in the U.S., now other black people in other groups. So, to answer your question, I'm not very, very hopeful at this point about how we can reimagine a system that does not want to reimagine a better future for us.
I want to jump down to Nate at the end. Nate, tell us what your shirt says, and then tell us what you're thinking about how we can do better for families.
Sure. Stephanie, thank you so much for tough to follow that. But my shirt says, all poverty is a policy failure, which is it's something that's really core to what I believe about our system. And I think when we talk about reforming the child welfare system, I think it starts with taking away their biggest asset, which is poverty. Joyce said 87% of kids who end up in the child welfare system are there because of neglect, and there's all sorts of research linking neglect to poverty. And so what I talked about before was how our system that's supposed to help families with the cost burden of raising a child, which on average in the United States now, from 0 to 18, this is not counting post-secondary education, is over $300,000. And we guarantee parents $0 to do that job. So to do the most important job in the country, which is raise our future, you're taking on a $300,000 debt into which the government and society who relies on you doing that job is not helping you at all. And so I think if we want to address issues within the child welfare system and all these carceral issues that people have been talking about, well, their biggest asset is poverty, and it starts by taking away that poverty. In the long run, I would love to see guaranteed income for families. In the short run, we're working on just including low-income families in the tax credits that we already have. Everyone wants to talk about the middle class. That's a political winner. And so that's where the money ends up flowing. And so we're looking at policies in the short term, as soon as 2023, that we have these, we call them trapezoids, where they phase in, they reach a top, usually in the middle, and then they phase out. Getting rid of these trapezoid policies. Every parent and child is deserving of a certain level of income, and you shouldn't have to work a certain amount of hours to get that money, because parenting is already a job. And so, you know, when I go to Annapolis and I have these conversations, the first question we get is, how are you going to pay for it? And so there's, you know, we have to have answers to that question. At the state level, we're talking about things like they already have a surplus. There's a $17 billion surplus left over from ARPA. There's $2 billion extra dollars because they underestimated how rich folks had gotten in Maryland. We are the richest state in the country by median income, the richest state in the country. The child poverty rate in Baltimore is 33%. That's 1 in 3 kids. And we all know there are some communities where it's much higher than that. And these poverty thresholds are not high. Like for a family of 4, we're talking about $28,000. So $29,000, you're not in poverty. You're not in that statistic. I think the money partially comes from redistributive justice in terms of Maryland's top marginal tax rate is 5.75%. In DC, it's 10.25%. But it also means redistributing money from the systems that we're talking about up here, where we criminalize poverty and taking that money and giving it to parents so they can provide their basic needs. We did a study recently, and we haven't publicized it yet, but in Baltimore, in 2023, we're going to spend more than $1,000 per person on the police. That's more than any major city in the country. More than $1,000 per person. So if you live in Baltimore, 1,000 of your tax dollars, just your local tax dollars, goes towards the police. The national average is 300. So if Baltimore just went down to that national average, it's about 350 actually. That could provide a guaranteed income of over $3,000 per child. So we ran the numbers, right? I'm pretty good with census data. And so we looked at the numbers and we found that if we did that, we'd cut deep child poverty in half. We'd cut child poverty across the city by 33%. That lifts 14,000 kids out of poverty in this city, 13,000 which are black, because we know there's racial disparities across the city, just by saying, not completely defunding the police, just saying we're going to spend what everyone else spends. So bring it back to the question here. We will make every problem easier to solve if we reduce and hopefully eventually eliminate child poverty across the state, country, wherever.
Let's keep talking about money. I mean, the child welfare system has a lot of money. And we see money poured into institutions for children. We see money poured into foster parents and foster care subsidies. We have legislation that incentivizes adoption, but you don't get anything if you reunify children with their families. How can we spend that money differently? What else? We can give people financial resources. What else, Joyce?
Yeah, we could give people financial resources so we could just provide the basic things we should be providing. As an example, in my community, I remember, even being a person of color, not always seeing, right, the subliminal stuff and the systemic racism, which is the invisible part of the racism. And I remember growing up believing that the schools in my community were failing because parents didn't go to open school nights. I really believed that shit. And they used to say, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot they said don't curse today. But they used to say, look, it's open school night and parents are not showing up, and you want to know why the schools in your neighborhood are failing. If the parents are not coming, then how are the schools going to have the things they need? But then I grew up and I learned that the school in your community is funded by the home ownership tax. And in most of our communities, that's where the low-income housing is, and that's not where residential housing is, and there is no homeowner tax. And so we could, one, do the things we said, like when they pushed Lotto many years ago, they said, oh, this is gonna help fund schools, but not in my community, right? And so we say, if children are not reading on a certain grade level by the 5th grade or the 6th grade, that we're going to build a prison because that's the trajectory of what their outcome will be, because if you can't read or write, you're going to be reduced to a life of crime. But why did you start preparing a prison for 10 years later instead of building an after-school program? Right? So it's not that they don't have the money, it's that they're investing their money in the failure of certain communities, because poverty and slavery is big business.
I really can't go down the road of talking about how the current child welfare system could spend its money better. We have to be spending the money outside of the current child welfare system. We are the only wealthy country in the world that behaves as we do, and we have to stop and join the world. I don't believe we will, but I'm not going to bother saying what we could do better in this system. This is a propaganda game. It's not about child welfare.
I just want to, before you go, Stephanie, talking about propaganda, right? It's the narratives that have people believe this is the truth about us. It's the narratives that have us believing this is the truth about us. You'll have the black cop beat your ass faster than the white cop because he got something to prove to his white counterpart that, see, I'm not like them. I'm a different black person, right? These are the things that happen. So it's internalized, and it's just spread. It's poison. And it all comes down on people who have been forced into a certain situation. But when we start talking about propaganda, I start thinking about how did Child Protection Services become to be this known, trusted governmental agency that people rely on to protect kids when we see the outcomes of children who have spent time in this horrendous system? When we go into the home or people go in as a caseworker or a social worker, why do they see the simple problem that the family's facing, that one thing, that isolated thing, that thing that could be rectified with a little bit of funding that you have? Because just in New York City, our CPS agency has $3.5 billion. But yet the kids change home using garbage bags while the president of the foster care agency is paid $500,000 or more. These narrative things. So I'm working on a couple of things in New York, and I just wanted to share that real quick before Stephanie lit us up again.
Joyce, I appreciate that. Shireen, you mentioned.
Wait, Stephanie, don't light them up yet. So, so the narrative change, one, legislation, Miranda rights. Why would someone want to stop you from knowing your rights at minimum? Why is that not just a due process thing that everyone should know their rights? Why would they want to withhold someone's rights? But that simple thing did not pass my legislative last year. So I decided to do what CPS has been doing for over 50 years, circumventing the legislator by creating ads using MTA bus ads in New York City, MTA subway ads, billboards, and anything else where I can get a writing. I even printed out 4,000 signs and wheat pasted them throughout the city. Yep, I wheat pasted them because Marty was on call. So with that being said, I want people to know their rights. So I'm telling people what their rights are. Every day throughout the city in other ways other than our legislators, who, I'm just going to tell the truth, are being paid for by the industries that are trying to keep the same thing happening. My legislator in my community does not work for me. I am not afraid to say it. He know he don't. She know she don't. She know that the unions and the other people in the school boards or whoever it is paying for their election. And so they're not trying to hear what I got to say. And even though they look like me, they are protecting the children at the border, but not the ones in their own community.
That's true.
Let me just clarify real quick, because I think Marty misunderstood my question. I am not talking about shifting funds within the system by the system, right? I am also a believer of defunding this system, right? So taking those funds away and pouring them into community and other means. That was what the question was about.
And
I
that's
just
what
wanted
the
to
answer
clarify.
is. We should build all communities so
That's
that
right. That's right.
that's the answer.
That's right.
That's a period right there.
And so one of the things that I'm glad we're talking about taking the money out and putting it back into the community, particularly with the families, because one of the things that I'm seeing that is really burning me up, I'm watching how the foster parents that they're recruiting, the quote unquote resource parents that are really, in my opinion, trying to steal people's children. I'm not saying that some don't do a good job, But I've noticed in a particular jurisdiction specifically, whenever we are, I mean, it could be at the first initial 6-month statutory hearing, statutory review hearing, they're already asking about the whole path to TPR. And they act like they are working in support of the parents. Oh, I want to, you know, they can call me, they can email me. But on the other end, excuse me, they are undermining these parents to the workers. And I see them doing it all the time. Excuse me. And then they come to me and they're asking all of these questions, but the questions, pardon me, are really geared, I got a tickle in my throat. The questions are really geared towards them really not supporting the parents, but really wanting to take their children. And I'm seeing it repeatedly. And it's a particular demographic that is doing it consistently. And so for me, I would really like to see that money. But okay, so you're saying that such and such needs parenting classes. Do they all need parenting classes? Do they all need the exact same parenting class?
We all just the same, so cookie cutter for us.
Yeah, so I'm gonna stop because I just throw. But yeah, shifting the money into the families to remedy whatever issues.
Right, because it doesn't even make sense that you would pull a child out of the home, and I don't like calling them foster parents, I call them foster agents. So, yeah, they're agents of the government, hired to be state guardians of children, disrespect their parents, work hard to keep them separated, because guess what? If that kid stays in my home, that's guaranteed income. We talk about guaranteed income, our children are their guaranteed income. So when we talk about shifting, why are you pulling my kid out of my home because you say that I don't have food, but yet you're going to provide money to a foster agent, a judge, and everyone else in the court, and an attorney, and all these other people to keep a kid away from their parent, saying that you're protecting them when all you had to do is bring a bag of damn groceries? It makes no sense. Remember, 87% are related of these removals are related to poverty that is poverty being framed as neglect. And so it's not, again, not that we don't have the money, it's how we choose to use the money. And so I would like to see a shift in how the money is used. I'd like to see communities as some type of reparations, maybe. Give us back some of the shit that you have taken from us. For everything we get from them, they're collecting data to figure out how to combat and prevent us from having a leg up. CPS agent come to your home because someone said the kid ate 2 meals at school, which leads them believe there's no food in the house, but the kid is just greedy, right? That's his favorite meal. It ain't got nothing to do with me not having food, but you come because I ain't have no food, so you say. But you're asking me, do I have a boyfriend?
Yeah.
You're asking me about my mental health. You're checking my medicine cabinets. You're searching my dresser drawers. You're going in my garbage cans. You're asking me to sign HIPAA forms. Now, she said don't curse, so I'm going to say, what the F does that have to do with anything? It doesn't have nothing to do with what they say they were there for. They're really there to collect data, and that's what preventive service is about. So please, people in the audience, I don't know where Shireen is going with this conversation because I ain't prepped with her, but please don't tell me that preventive service is going to be the answer to anything, because it don't prevent nothing. You can't prevent someone from being broke if you have prevented them from having jobs, prevented them from being educated, prevented them from having their children be at home, and all of the other things that you do to destroy families. And now you want to come back and tell me that you're preventing something by surveilling me and collecting data so you can figure out where my weak spots are so you can create more shit to continue to harm me.
Joyce, I'm glad you raised the data about the number and percentages of families who come to the attention of the child welfare system due to neglect. Because there's somebody out here that's wondering, well, what about those children who are physically abused, who are sexually abused? What are we going to do for those children?
What we're going to do, we're going to actually provide help for once, right? But that's a small percentage. And I'm not saying that they don't matter. But what I'm saying is the greatest harm that's happening right now is a overwhelming percentage of the children should not have been in this harmful system. And if we focused on the small amount of children, I think it's roughly 12, 13%, that actually need or may need the support or some type of intervention for their safety, imagine the wonderful job we could do for them if we use those resources to stop paying foster presidents $500,000 a year and had a nice, safe place and proper services or supports for whatever the issue is that that young person and their family is facing or seeing as a challenge.
Somebody else is wondering about this future for this system and what it holds. I mean, does mandated reporting exist? Does the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act exist? The Adoption and Safe Families Act and the major legislation
I'm
that
an
governs child
abolitionist.
welfare?
It all goes. It's all gone. History, because first of all, the child welfare system, as they like to call it, I call it the family policing system because they police families. And it's like a chain, right? If you wear a little tiny thin chain, some people like little thin chains, and you take that chain and you shake it up in your hand like you would dice and you throw it in. Everybody in here, I know, at least black people, got a junk drawer, right? You throw it in the junk drawer and you leave it there for 6 months. You will never untangle that chain. You will never untangle it. You take a big, thick chain, a bike chain, you could put it in the drawer for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You take it out, it's never going to be tangled. This system is like that little thin chain. And it has safety mechanisms built into it. And so what that means is even if you break a part of the chain's going to still remain tangled. You can't just break a piece and then pull it apart. You cannot pull this system apart. You have to demolish it and begin to put things in place, and I'm not going to call it a system, but you have to put things in place that will support families when they need support. And the families should be the drivers of what that looks like and how it's provided. Because you can give me my favorite meal on a beautiful platter, I may take it. You give me the meal I'm asking for on a garbage can lid, it's not as appetizing. So it has to be appetizing to the family for them to take it and for them to embrace it and for them to utilize it. It can't be a trap.
Before we turn to questions, I'm gonna go to Jamar real quick, who's been super quiet. Yeah. On our last panel, Nicole Hansen said something that she likes to leave every one of her audiences and all of her conversations with an alert or an action. So what's on your mind, Jamar? What do you want to leave people with today?
My bad. I think that in pushing forward with working with the community and families, there are one existential question that you should be asking yourself, especially those that are students out here, especially those that are professionals. What are you going to do with the tools that you have? There were 2 transformative things that happened to me, cathartic moments that happened to me in college. One was reading a book called The Pedagogy of Oppressed by Paulo Freire. He talked about in that book the banking system. Now, he was referring to it in a more educational way, but I can transfer that to what we look at the systems or these systems that we work with because they all the same. He talks about either you're doing 2 things. Are you maintaining the status quo or are you being transformative? My point is you should be transformative. Another thing that was cathartic for me was I had a professor in college too as well. His name was M.K. Asante. He had something. He used to have a mantra called, "If you make an observation, you have an obligation." I'm gonna say that again. If you make an observation, you have an obligation. It stuck with me because it rhymed, and I'm a big hip hop fan. But it's basically, if you see something, you have an obligation to do something about it. Whenever I want to be fortified, or I need some gratitude, or I need some fortification, I guess, I always refer to the mantra. I think that with the education that we get, with the tools that we receive, we should not, the time to be mediocre with that stuff is done. It's 2022. It's time for us to have transformative thoughts, transformative thinking. It's time for us to not go in these systems and just be replicants and carbon copies in these systems. We all have something to offer here. So I think that in pushing forward, to answer your question, I think that those that have these tools should be thinking transformatively. So that's it.
Thank you, Jamar.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Any brave folks want to take the mic? Somebody back there?
Hi, good afternoon. I've enjoyed the conversation. My name is Tomoko Shine. I'm a cultural anthropologist, founding director of Aging People in Prison Human Rights Campaign. I went to a conference similar to this yesterday in Delaware, and I'm a little concerned that some of these conversations are coming under reform. And this system cannot be reformed. That's a FYI if no one got it for 2022. And the young man just used the word transformation. And I have another FYI. I was given a presentation in New York some years ago, and the person was given an award. White lady has a restorative program in California, and she was worried. She said, "I'm concerned with all this talk that maybe we're expanding the criminal justice system and not decarcerating." And so Grace Lee Boggs taught us that going into the system, you think you're going to change it, that's not going to work. And so we have people up here who spend 50 years, 30 years to come out of a system to realize, and the lady said the last panel, 70 years it hasn't changed. And so I think the people in this room and students are going to have to begin to be taught by professors. If you think you're going to make changes in the system, it's not going to happen. We need people that are building and transforming outside of the system. Otherwise, you'll be here in 10 years with your students encouraging them to go into a system that is a complete failure. And then, in fact, the people that are supposed to be helping, you end up causing harm to the system and to the families. So I think some real conversations going to happen. People may have to make some reflections. You may have to change your lane. You may have to change your life. You may have to change your goals. It's been 400 years for people of African descent. We're not waiting no more. And some things people of African descent are going to have to do themselves. No white saviors are coming for us. Mm-hmm. No one is going to help us. And some things white people are going to have to do themselves. And some things they're going to have to take the lead in. And some things they're going to have to sacrifice. This is the reality of the situation at hand. So we got to begin to have some real talk, make some real decisions, have some real actions. That's just my little 1 cent. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
So as she passes that mic, sit with this. If foster care was a good thing, Black children would only get into affirmative action.
Anyone else want to share, have a question, anything that resonated with you?
Hi, thank you so much for being here. This is amazing. Following up with what the woman just said, as a law student who's getting ready to finish law school and enter the system, but who does totally believe in the mission of abolition of many of these systems, what would you say to somebody like me, a white student who's becoming an attorney? How do we do this? How do I navigate this system and work to kind of dismantle it at the same time that I'm entering it? It's a very confusing place to be. And what would you say to that, if you can answer that?
If I may. Go ahead, Marty. You have to really go with the mindset that the power belongs to the people that you serve. Frederick Douglass had a speech. I'm going to use a lot of quotes, but Frederick Douglass had the speech on 4th of July. He said, "To what does the 4th of July mean to the Negro?" But I would just challenge you and say, to what does the system mean to you, to the people you serve? There was another guy named Haruki Murakami that said, if an egg smashes against a tall, hard wall, whether the egg is wrong and the wall is right, we should be standing with the egg, right? So you always want to be in the mindset of the people have the power. The system is already made. It's the wall. It's already made. So you're already coming in a system that's already made. Make sure that you come with the mindset that the power belongs to the people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jamal.
And I would add that I've trained generations of law students who have gone into the field as family defenders. And Dorothy Roberts was a keynote speaker at our national conference a couple of years ago, creating some concern among the audience that they weren't abolitionists, and maybe Dorothy would think they're not using their skills appropriately. And she laughed at that and said, "Of course you're contributing to the world I want." So fiercely defending parents and speaking truth to power is fully in accord with a vision of dramatic change.
Thank you, Marty. Thank you all for. Do we have time for another question?
Sure.
One more.
Oh, so we just want to warn people that are parked in spots that start towing at 4 o'clock that they do tow. So if you are in a parking area like on North Charles that says only valid till 4, they do enforce the rule.
3:49. We taking another question?
Yeah, Mr.
One more question.
I just wanted to say, I am a proud social worker at the Public Defender's Office, and I cannot say enough. We've talked about the federal laws today. We've talked about the child welfare system, but there are over 750,000 social workers in this country. 335,000 of them work in the child welfare system. The social workers are the ones who also have to be held accountable when we're not practicing in the true sense of what the word social work means. And how do we, as social workers, begin to have these conversations with schools of social work who continue with the propaganda that the child welfare system is not biased and that it doesn't harm children of color? That's what we're facing.
Mm-hmm. There's a recent article that came out that Joyce was a part of, and the title is something like Defund Social Workers. So it might be of interest as a path forward to start having that conversation more. So thank you all for listening. Thank you to these amazing panelists. I feel honored to have shared the space with them today. And we're going to turn it over briefly to Rebecca Stahl, Executive Director at CFCC.
Thank you all so much. Honestly, I don't know how to follow that. You are all amazing. As Shireen said and Shanta said, I'm Rebecca. I am the CFCC Executive Director. And more than anything, my job right now is to say thank you and to wrap up from all that has been said today, which is an almost impossible task, which seems a little unfair. But most importantly, I want to start where Shanta started, which is to say thank you to everyone here who has been impacted by these systems. We know that it is difficult to sit up here and share your stories over and over again, and thank you for doing it. Thank you for keeping us all honest and reminding us that we have work to do. That, Jamar, as you said, when we see something, we have to make change. And thank you for that reminder. All day, every day, that is what we need to remind ourselves to do. I want to thank every one of our panelists for being here today, for coming, many of you from New York, from other cities across the country. Wisconsin, that's awesome. And I will say it Wisconsin and not Wisconsin, I promise. And I want to also say thank you to everyone who came here today who may not have known what we were going to be talking about, may have seen something different, something new. I hope we all took something new from today. I certainly did, right? I went to law school as somebody who wanted to change a system and realized the system isn't able to be changed. And so thank you for reminding us that we have to find new ways. And if I think about today, and I think about all that everybody said, and to try and wrap it up into these words, here's what I heard. The word shame and secrecy came up. The words trauma came up a lot. But what I also heard was community, that it starts with community, right? It becomes transformation when we can find ourselves in community. And how do we do that? We do it through empathy. We do it through compassion, through dignity, and through seeing the humanity in every single person always. There is nobody on this planet, there is no group of people who are inherently violent or inherently criminal. We are all inherently human, first and foremost. And that was the message over and over and over again today, is that the only way to make change is to restructure the entire community, the entire society in which we live, right? To start to see every other person as human first. Because there is no difference, there is humanity. And when we can start to see that, we can start to begin the healing process. And that is not an easy thing. Odina talked about intergenerational trauma and the impact, and you all know I could stand up here and talk about trauma for days, right? But what we do know is that we can actually heal, and we do that through community. That's the one thing we know that heals trauma is community. And we heard that over and over and over again today. So I invite everybody here to take everything that these amazing panelists, our community out in the audience shared with us and say, how can I become better about community? We were asked over lunch to talk to somebody we didn't know. Can we do that every day of our lives, right? Can we learn to meet people everywhere we go and start by saying, who are you? Tell me your story. I want to share my story so that we get to know each other better and we can start to change society, because that is the only way that these things get better. It's not through systems. It's through society, care, compassion, and dare I say, love. So I want to say thank you all so much for being a part of this, for sharing CFCC's first in-person event since 2019. Gloria, it's wonderful that you came here to be with us. And to all of you who have been a part of this community for so long, as we continue to grow, that we can connect to new people, that we can get to know each other, and that we can start to make some shift and change throughout the world. Thank you all so much, and go get your cars if they're on Charles Street.